Welcome back, everybody. We're still in Module 35. We're going to look at Part 2, so kind of the second half of this section, and lots of interesting topics here, so I'm going to dive right in. The first video talked about some of the problem-solving strategies, so we're going to continue with those, and again, some of the ways that we can be led astray in our problem-solving and our decision-making. So on this slide here, you see the first bullet point. We're talking about intuition. And if you've ever, think about what intuition is, it's basically, going with your gut. Maybe you've been told by people in your life, always trust your gut. Just go with your gut. Sorry. Well, I'm here to tell you that that is, in general, an okay strategy, but it's not a foolproof strategy. It's not going to lead you to the right answer 100% of the time. In fact, most cognitive psychologists would say that your intuition is maybe like a C+ student. So maybe between 75 and 80% of the time it's right. So here on the slide it talks about these are fast, automatic feelings or thoughts. Again, going with your gut. This is an adaptive thing that we do this because there are times where, and lots of times where it's good just to go with your gut because we can't sit there and make a detailed analysis on every single decision. That would take way too long, so this is a way of kind of using those heuristics, those mental shortcuts to make quick decisions so we can get on with our life and not agonize over, super salad. So it's okay to go with your gut on many things. Just know that, big life decisions, I would encourage you to, look at the data as well. Don't just go with your gut. Some other flaws and biases in decision making. Some of these are not in the book, but I just think they're really interesting. One, it's called loss aversion, and the idea here is that humans really, really, really do not like to lose. We see losing as disproportionately more serious, more negative than the possible benefits of winning. Also, like if you think of two scenarios like losing $10 versus losing $100, we would see losing $100 as more than 10 times worse than losing $10. So we are kind of wired to be a very much loss averse. And this can lead to what's called a sunk cost fallacy. This is where maybe we've invested something into a situation, and it makes us keep putting more resources into it rather than just cut our losses. I think of an example of maybe you get sick, and maybe you've got a vacation planned, and maybe a plane ticket and a hotel, and instead of just cutting your losses and saying, well, I'm not going to go. You might try to tough it and get through it, but you're miserable the entire time. Or you're in a relationship that you've been in for 2-3 years or longer, and you're not really happy anymore. But maybe you say, well, I've put so much into it. I don't want to, we don't want to lose all of that time that we've put into it, because then it feels like we've wasted that time. So what do? We just double down. We put more into it. So that's what we call the sunk cost fallacy. We also oftentimes overestimate things that are rare, yet we underestimate things that are more frequent. So we might, overestimate the likelihood of winning the lottery, but things that are more common, we would say, oh, that's not going to happen to me. So we don't have a very good sense of just how frequent some things are. We oftentimes fall victim to what's called gambler's fallacy. We assume that events will just kind of even out. The whole, I'm due theory. So, maybe you're, you're gambling with a friend or playing a card game, or, maybe you're doing fantasy football or something, and your team's been doing really poor, and you're like, I'm due to win. Well, the psychology would say differently. Just because you lost last time doesn't mean that you're more likely to win a next time. Just because that doesn't lead that to happen. And then on the bottom slide here, the bottom part of the slide, it says regression to the mean. We tend to oftentimes let recent occurrences distort what we look at moving forward. So, if there's like and I keep using sports analogies here, but let's say you have a basketball player who averages 5 points a game, but all of a sudden they have like a 30-point game. And you think, okay, well, how much are they likely to score in the next game? A lot of people would tend to overinflate. Well, maybe they'll score 15 or 20 or 25. But if you look, and there's a lot of games that have been played, and if they're sitting at 5 points, statistically, they're likely to score 5. They're going to be close to the average. But again, we have a tendency to inflate that. So those are just some interesting ones, and interesting ways that we bias our decision making. We'll go past that. Some different specific heuristics. Again, these mental shortcuts that can affect the way we think. One of these, and this one's not in the book, but it's called the anchoring heuristic. So we don't estimate a decision from a neutral starting point. We can let an earlier estimate inflate our guess. So if I ask you the question, what's the population of Brazil? Is it more or less than 70 million? I'd get some people that would say more. I'd get some people that say less. But if I then asked you, what do you think the population of Brazil is? People would tend to give answers that are probably closer to 70 million. So that set of 70 million kind of anchored people's guess close to 70 million. Whereas if I changed it from 70 million to 200 million, some people would say more, some people would say less. But then if I asked you to guess the population, they'd probably guess the population higher. And the population of Brazil is over 250 million. So again, when I asked the question the way that I did, it influenced people's guesses. So you can see how that could be practical within negotiations. The person that makes the first offer, think about how that could influence what the eventual selling price, of a car, of a house, those kind of things. The next two are ones that are very important for the AP curriculum. They're definitely in the book. You're going to definitely see these on an AP test. The first one here is the representativeness heuristic. So when you make a decision about something, or especially someone, we judge the likelihood of things not on statistics, but on how well something or someone matches a prototype or a stereotype. So this is kind of the cognitive basis for how we stereotype things. So we use those prototypes we talked about in the Module 34 video. So if I give you an example here on the slide, it says, if someone is skinny with glasses, has an IQ of 140, which is really high, are they more likely to be a rocket scientist or a truck driver? Now, when I do this in class, most people tend to say rocket scientist, because that matches, when they view a rocket scientist, the description I gave you, skinny with glasses, high IQ, matches the rocket scientist more than the truck driver. However, if you just look at the odds, think about how many rocket scientists are out there and how many truck drivers are out there. There's way more truck drivers. So statistically, it's more likely that this person is a truck driver. But again, because the description matched the prototype of a rocket scientist, that's where a lot of people would go. So this is an example of the representativeness heuristic. As for myself, I'm short, I'm stocky. When I was growing up, in high school, I actually, played many sports, but I actually played basketball at least through 11th grade, believe it or not. But a lot of people just assumed that I was a wrestler because I fit the prototype of what a wrestler looked like. So you understand that your brain does these things, that your brain naturally likes to put things into groups and hope that it matches the prototype, so this is what I think you are. But understand that, again, your mind and your gut, your intuition is not perfect. The other one here is the availability heuristic. This is where we estimate the likelihood of something based on how available, how fresh it is in your memory, how easy it is to recall something. So if something comes to mind readily, it's vivid, it tends to make an impact on us more than just cold hard data. So think about classic example, plane crashes versus car crashes. Statistically, riding in a plane is way safer than driving in a car. But a lot of people are afraid of flying in planes. It's because part of it is because when a plane crashes on the news, you definitely hear about it, but you don't really hear about it if there. Well, you might, but there's less of a chance that you would hear about it if a car crashed. So the memory of a plane crash is vivid in your mind, so you overestimate how likely it is. You tend to underestimate how likely a car crash is. So this is one example of an availability heuristic. We'll talk more about this in class too, because this one is one that you kind of need to hear about several times before it clicks. So, the other example in the slide here, school shootings. They're terrible and awful and sad, but you think about the likelihood of dying from a school shooting versus dying of other things, it's still very, very low. But because we hear about it on the news a lot, we tend to overinflate how dangerous or the likelihood that would be what would take our life. So that's the availability heuristic. These are some different likelihoods of death. Think about what we see on the news versus these rates. So, auto accident is the most common on this slide, but we don't hear about those very much. Suicide, we hear about those a little bit more, especially if it's a young person. And then, terrorist attack. We hear about terrorist attacks all the time on the news when they occur, but statistically, it's very unlikely that an individual in our country would die of a terrorist attack. So you can take a look at these and we'll kind of wrap up which heuristic would go with the scenario. So if you want to hit pause and guess, and then we'll come back. Okay, so it says Mr. Dow gets asked quite frequently about being a wrestler due to his build. That's because I fit the prototype of a wrestler, so that would be the representativeness heuristic. The fact that the prosecution goes first in a courtroom setting puts the defendant at a disadvantage with a jury. I would say that's the anchoring heuristic. The prosecution gets to go first. They kind of get to set the narrative. They kind of get to define the box that the case gets talked about, and then the defendant has to fight that. And then it says, when choosing which restaurant to go to, you go to Jimmy John's because you just saw a commercial for Jimmy John's on TV. So because Jimmy John's is fresh in your mind, freaky fast and fresh, because it's fresh in your mind when you think of sandwiches, the first thing that pops into your head is Jimmy John's. So I think that's a good place to stop. We might do another little short one for this section, but hang in there. I know there's a lot in this section, but there's a lot of interesting stuff and a lot of important stuff. So we'll talk to you soon.